Hi there. You know, sometimes in life it's difficult to know the things you're supposed to do. It's not easy, sometimes to fulfill all the duties and responsibilities that fall upon us. We can face all sorts of pressures all the time. But you know what? What's true of everyday life can also be true about our spiritual life. What's interesting to me is that when God wants us to do things and we don't do them, sometimes He has rather interesting ways of making sure we get what needs to be done. And what I want us to do today is take a story that illustrates what I'm talking about, one that has a lot of twists and turns. And I'm going to suggest that it has a really surprised ending. Welcome to the Bible Project Daily Podcast. Hi friends, as I said, we're about to launch off in a new chapter today. We're going to be covering Genesis chapter 31 over the next 3 episodes, looking at this story of Jacob and his wives and the relationships with his father and their family, the chap called Laban. And we're going to be covering the text of all of Genesis chapter 31 over the next 3 episodes. Now, sometimes it's difficult in life for any of us to discern and interpret what we should be doing. And even when we do, sometimes we don't do all the things that we really know in our hearts we ought to do. It's not easy, sometimes to fulfill all our duties and responsibilities just in the world itself. The duties that we have, we really sometimes can have a pressure and pulling them off and getting everything done. I think we all feel under pressure at times, but what's true of life and the everyday is even more so when it comes to thinking about our spiritual life. Sometimes God really wants us to do things, and sometimes we struggle to do that which we know God wants us to do. But what's interesting to me is that sometimes when there are things that God wants us to do, He comes up with rather interesting ways to ensure that we do them, particularly if it's something that we should have done in the first place. Now, if you're thinking, what in the world is he talking about? Well, we're going to look at a story that illustrates, I believe, these very points. It's one that has a lot of twists and turns in it, and I'm going to suggest that when we get towards the end of it, you'll find there's a bit of a reveal, a bit of a surprise ending. So I invite your attention as we work together through Genesis chapter 31. Now, before we launch off, I'll just give a quick recap of where we are. If you recall, Jacob had fled his homeland and had gone to this far country in the east, and he meets a man called Laban, who turns out to be a relative of his. Now, Laban is married and has 2 daughters, and at this point in the story, God is revealing to Jacob that He wants him back in the land that he originally came from. That's where the Lord wanted him to be, probably for some time now. And the question is, what will He have to do to get him to go back there, to get him to be, Jacob and his family, to be where they're supposed to be? And that's what this story is going to be about in Genesis chapter 31. So let's just pick up the text with the opening couple of verses, which tell us this. Jacob heard that Laban's sons were saying, "Jacob has taken everything our father owned and has gained all this wealth from what belonged to our father." And Jacob noticed that Laban's attitude towards him was not what it had been. It actually says Laban's facial expression changed. Now you have to remember what happened back in chapter 30 here. Laban wanted Jacob to work for him, and they struck a deal wherein they divided up the sheep and goats. Jacob was to take care of the flock, but he could keep for himself any speckled, spotted or striped varieties and the odd coloured animals, and that should be the part that should be his wages for caring for the complete flocks. Now Jacob, through a combination of his own guile and the providence of God, began to prosper, and the flocks and herds grew and grew greatly. And at this point, the story opens with Laban's son, in other words, Jacob's wife's brothers, saying, hey, wait a minute, look at Jacob here, he's getting wealthy, and that wealth really should have stayed with our father. But remember, the deal was that he could get to keep the odd coloured and striped and speckled sheep and goats and so forth. But Laban's sons are saying that the Lord here is really blessing Jacob's, and that the flocks that he has, that he owns, are really expanding. And well, these brothers, these sons of Laban, they don't like it at all. What's going on here is nothing more than, of course, than jealousy. But Jacob hears about this. He sees the attitude and the countenance of his father change towards him, and it bothers him. Jacob noticed Laban's attitude is changing towards him, and in fact the King James and some of the other translations give away the fact that Laban's facial attitude changes away from Jacob. He's no longer favourable towards him. Jacob is making all this money, to put it in modern parlance, and the brothers think, you know what, this is being done at our expense. So Jacob sees the unfavourable family situation playing out before him and thinks, you know, this is not good, this is not going to end well. So let's keep reading. Verse 3 says, then the Lord said to Jacob, go back to the land of your fathers and to your relatives, and I will be with you. So now this third factor emerges into the story, in that the Lord comes along and Jacob and says, you know what, it's time you went back home. I want you back home. Remember, the homeland from when he came is the land to which he had been promised, and that God had promised to give him and to always remain with him there. So on top of this unfavourable family situation developing at the moment, Jacob also is seen to get a direct word from the Lord, and that word is to head back to his homelands. So the ducks are all lining up, aren't they? The signs are all lining up and saying, it's time to go back home, Jacob. The narrative then says in verse 4, so Jacob sent word to Rachel and Leah to come out to the field where the flocks were. He said to them, I see that your father's attitude towards me is not what it was before, but the God of my father has been with me. You know I have worked for your father with all my strength, yet your father has cheated me, changing my wages 10 times. However, God has not allowed him to harm me. Continuing on with the text, if he said, the speckled ones will be your wages, then all the flocks gave birth to speckled young. And if he said, the streaked ones will be your wages, then all the flocks bore streaked young. So God has taken away your father's livestock and given them to me. In breeding season, I once had a dream in which I looked up and saw that the male goats mating with the flock were streaked, speckled, or spotted. The angel of God said to me in the dream, Jacob, and I answered, here I am. And he said, look up and see that all the male goats mating with the flock are streaked, speckled, or spotted, for I have seen all that Laban has been doing to you. I am the God of Bethel, where you anointed a pillar, and where you made a vow to me now. Now leave this land at once and go back to your native land. Now, I covered off last time that this clearly reveals that although God used Jacob's personality, the blessing and the multiplication of the crops did in fact come through and via the providence of God. It was not a scheme it was not Jacob's scheming that successfully brought about his wealth and prosperity. Now we'll just pause for a second here because of all the stuff that's happening. It's quite a lot of narrative to take in, but the bottom line is he has now decided he's going to go back home. But remember, Laban's 2 daughters are his wives, so Jacob calls the wives and say, come out with me into the field. So I think this suggests there's going to be a private little meeting outside where he will explain in great detail what they probably already knew, because in effect they had witnessed this. So this text I've read is a narrative where he in essence describes these events to them, and they remember the fact And he reminds him of the fact that he made a deal with his father and that his father has kept changing the conditions of that. In fact, he tells us here that they've been changed 10 times. So by reminding them of all the twists and turns and reminding them that it was in fact the Lord that still, in spite of the machinations of the father, had multiplied their flocks and herds, reminding them of all this, particularly telling them, look, it is the Lord that brought us all this prosperity. So in effect, he's explaining to them, and he says that in the process of all this, the Lord has now come before me, appeared to me and spoke to me and said it's now time to return to my homeland. And he also reminds them that the promise is that if he goes there, the promise is that the Lord will be with him always. So let's see how they reply to this, Rachel and Leah. It tells us, then Rachel and Leah replied, do we still have any share in the inheritance of our father's estate? ? Does he not regard us as foreigners? Not only has he sold us, but he has used up what was paid for us. Surely all the wealth that God took away from our father belongs to us and our children. So do whatever God has told you. So Rachel and Leah answered him and said to him, well, on one level, there's still an inheritance due to us from our father's house. So they get the message, we've got to go and where to go. But they also say, we're going to go back to your home, but there's a sense of injustice there that they feel that they still should have had an inheritance. Now, the father of these women had tried to deceive Jacob many times, and they recognize that, and they also say, by doing that to you, he was treating us, his daughters, as strangers. Remember the deal that was made with Jacob? Jacob wanted Rachel, and he had to work 7 years to get her, but Laban deceived him, so he then had to work another 7 years to get her, because he gave him Leah instead. So these girls are saying, look, we now recognize our father didn't actually treat us like daughters. He didn't give us a dowry with us, as was expected. He treated us like strangers because he effectively sold us to you, the opposite of what he was meant to do. So at this point, there's no love lost between the daughters and their father. And they say, you know what? We're with you, Jacob. Whatever God says to you to do it, and we'll go with you. So that's the story so far. But do you think Laban's going to let this happen very easily? Do you think they're just going to go to the father and say, we've decided to go back with Jacob to Jacob's homeland? Do you think Laban's going to accept that? Based on anything we know about him so far, do you think that seems very likely? Doesn't seem likely to me, does it? So they decide that they're going to go, and probably recognizing that truth, they decide to get out of town after dark. So let's pick up the story in verse 17. Then Jacob put his children and his wives on camels, and he drove all the livestock ahead of him, along with the goods he had accumulated in Padan Aram, to go to his father Isaac in the land of Canaan. When Laban had gone to shear his sheep, Rachel stole her father's household gods. Moreover, Jacob deceived Laban the Aramean by not telling him he was running away. So he fled with all he had and crossed the Euphrates River and headed for the hill country of Gilead. So like I said, they've got out of town and they do it under cover of darkness. But did you notice in the middle of those few verses what I just read? A rather odd part to this story. I wonder if something's jumped out at you over these verses that I've just read. Did you notice it says that she took something? She stole something, in fact, some of the translations say. And what did she take? Idols, household gods. What in the world did she do that for? In the first place, what actually were these household gods? And then why did she take them? Now you can imagine, if you go back and delve through some commentaries, they seem to go crazy trying to explain this text. And that's not surprising, because the text doesn't really tell us much more than the basic fact that she took them. As a matter of fact, both the ancient Jewish commentaries and the old Christian commentaries have come up with many different suggestions. Some say she took the idols not as idols, but she took them because they would have been made of precious metals and they would have had an intrinsic value, so she could melt them down and maybe sell them or something. Another possibility is the suggestion that she was trying to break her father from his idolatry. That's probably the most favourable interpretation you can find of these events. It seems, according to this view, that her plan was to take the idols and her father wouldn't have been able to be an idolater anymore. Another suggestion that appeared in more recent times is that she did it because she was, in a sense, she took the idols for her own personal use. One commentator I read said that though Rachel had a measure of faith in the one true God, we know from the events of the previous chapter, it would seem that as a daughter of her father, she would have been intimately attached to her father's religious practices. And now, with Jacob, she had sort of divided religious alliances. So in a sense, yes, she seemed to have come before the Lord, but also she was clinging on to something from the past. Not probably the superstition and not wishing to be deprived of any good luck that the idols of her father, she might have believed, would confirm upon them. And by the way, Laban's family did worship false gods alongside the true gods. That is clear from the text. Now, this just seems like a mind-bending contradiction to many of us today, but apparently in the Old Testament this has seemed to happen more than once. Now, I know that we need to accept that this kind of thing still happens today, and not just on the Christian mission field in foreign lands where we see the introduction of Christianity then get mixed with the local tribal religions. Make no mistake that this also happens in the Western Church even today, where people get the Christian faith mixed in with their existing false teaching. Now, there are some Bible teachers these days say that it's not possible if you're a Christian. You can't do that. But my response to that is, well, if you read the Bible with both eyes open, it appears to happen there on several occasions. And if it can happen then, surely it can happen today. The Bible never says that this is a good thing. It just recognizes that it happens. In fact, it clearly suggests it's quite the opposite. It is not the right thing to happen. But we have to ask ourselves honestly, how many Christians today still hold on to some of their old worldly superstition? One more comment by another modern commentator said, although she trusted in Jacob's God, she was also apparently reluctant to give up her previous superstitions. So maybe, just at nothing else, it was like people trusting in good luck charms, which many do today incorrectly. Maybe she thought by taking these things along with her, in some way it would help them on their journey or when they got to the new home in the land that they were going to. And you know, this attitude is a little different to many Christians today, and particularly new Christians today, who take a time to drop off some of their worldly ideas. They're happy to know the Lord, but they're not willing yet to separate off from the old superstitions and the ways of the world. But you know what? That's the whole purpose of the Christian discipleship. Our call to disciple new believers is the thing that will address those issues. We're called to help by training people to follow the correct path after they've made an initial commitment to follow the Lord. Even today, some people who really know the Lord appear to me to hang on to their idols. Now, sometimes their idols might be materialism or money or fame or greed, but they still hang on to their superstitions and their ideas, their worldly ideas. All right, that's the story so far. It's simply that Jacob decided for a whole bunch of reasons to get out of town, but primarily because the Lord told him to. He convinces his wives to come with him, and they leave town without Laban even knowing. But the only little caveat to this tale, the only little sting, is that Rachel takes some of the family's religious idols with her. I wonder how that will work out. Well, we'll find out next time. Okay, today's section, which is going to cover the middle part of Genesis chapter 31, I've called the final showdown. So we're going to pick up the story again. It's a long chapter, and there have been and there's going to be lots of twists and turns in the 55 verses that the story covers. But today we're picking up the narrative in verse 22, where it tells us this. On the third day, Laban was told that Jacob had fled. Taking his relatives with him, he pursued Jacob for 7 days and caught up with him in the hill country of Gilead. Then God came to Laban, the Aramean, in a desert at night and said to him, "Be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad." Just out of interest, describing Laban as an Aramean is what we would today call is where we would today call modern Syria. Now, the first question this might raise in your mind is why 3 days before Laban is told and decides to go off in pursuit of Jacob? Well, you may remember, if you were with us previously, in the last chapter when we looked at that, we were told that Laban moved his family 3 days away from Jacob. So that's why the news would take 3 days to arrive. So he's now discovered that Jacob has gone with his wives, which were his daughters, and he's taken them with him. And he's taken all the flocks and herds. They're all gone. They've left lock, stock, and barrel, so to speak. Laban then sets off and pursues them, and it takes 7 days, which is not surprising because remember, Jacob had a 3-day start, so we shouldn't be surprised that it took 7 days to catch him up. And it says that he catches him up eventually near the mountains of Gilead. Now, we know God had been protecting Jacob, and he will continue to do so. And in this case, he does so by speaking directly to Laban in a dream. And this is what he says. Now, Laban probably is in a response of anger chasing Jacob. So God appearing to him is really probably giving him an opportunity to just reflect on the situation. And it tells us this: Jacob had pitched his tent in the hill country of Gilead when Laban overtook him, and his relatives camped there too. Then Laban said to Jacob, "What have you done? You deceived me, and you've carried off my daughters like captives in war. Why did you run off secretly and deceive me? Why didn't you tell me so that I could send you away with joy and singing to the music of timbrels and harps? You didn't even let me kiss my grandchildren and my daughters goodbye. You have done a foolish thing. I have the power to harm you. But last night the God of your father said to me, be careful not to say anything to Jacob, either good or bad. Now you have gone off because you long to return to your father's household. But why did you steal my gods?" Jacob answered Laban, "I was afraid because I thought you would take your daughters away from me by force. But if you find anyone who stole your gods, that person shall not live. In the presence of our relatives, see for yourself whether there is anything of yours here with me, and if so, take it." Now Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen the household gods. All right, Laban, you see, is upset, and you might say justifiably so. He didn't have a chance to say goodbye to his daughters, and so he catches up here and he rebukes and he reprimands Jacob. But then he ends up saying, he concludes his little statement by saying, "Why did you take my household gods?" So this is something that's clearly a big thing for him. "I understand," he says, "that you might have wanted to leave and go back to your father's house and back to your land. I understand that, but why did you take my idols with you?" Now remember, Jacob doesn't have a clue about these stolen idols. He didn't know that they'd been taken. So he answers truthfully when he says, well, first of all, he says he was afraid and he left because he thought Laban might take his daughters back by force. But he also says, well, he didn't steal the idols, and if he finds anyone who has the gods, that person should not live. Now remember, Jacob did not know that Rachel had stolen them. Can you see what he's just done by making this statement? He's potentially pronounced a death sentence on his wife Rachel. "I haven't got them," he says, "but if you find them here, you can kill the one who has them." It's interesting, isn't it? I bet you can't wait to find out what's going to happen. I think if this was a story on television, this is the point where they'd have a commercial break to try and build some tension. Well, I hope you're sitting next to your seat, because what's going to happen when Laban searches for them? Picking up the narrative in verse 33, it says, So Laban went into Jacob's tent, and into Leah's tent, and into the tent of the two female servants, but found nothing. After he came out of Leah's tent, he entered Rachel's tent. Now Rachel had taken the household gods and put them inside her camel's saddle and was sitting on them. Laban searched through everything in the tent, but found nothing. Clever, eh? So Laban searches Jacob's tent, then Leah's tent, and then the tent of the two servants. But he doesn't find them. He doesn't find anything. But when he goes into Rachel's tent, remember it's Rachel who has taken the household idols, and she's put them in the camel's saddle that she's sitting on. So when he enters the tent, she's sitting on the saddle with the items in the saddlebag or under the seat of the saddle. Get the picture? Now it's important to note that a daughter would normally be expected to rise from wherever she was sitting and go and approach her father when he arrived and bow down as a sign of honour to the father. But throughout this all, she's remained sitting on the camel. This is what she says to her father. Verse 35. Rachel said to her father, Don't be angry, my lord, that I cannot stand in your presence. I'm having my period. So he searched, but could not find the household gods. So Laban searched all through the tent and did not find them because Rachel was sitting on them. Rachel makes the excuse to her father and says, Forgive me for not rising and coming before you because I'm having my period. And Laban, well, frankly, if he's anything like men, when women talk about such things, he probably thought, I don't really want to think about this and know about this. So she tricks him in plain sight of everyone, and when he searches the tent, he finds nothing. Now, a point worth making is, according to the book of Leviticus, for her to sit on those idols would have contaminated them and made them permanently unclean. So this would suggest that she doesn't really have a lot of respect for those idols by sitting on them in that way, which maybe help us have a more forgiving attitude about her relationship with them. And we discussed that in the previous chapter. But the big point is, at any rate, Laban doesn't find them. And it is this point we see Jacob respond to all that has gone on now and all that Laban has said. And the text continues, Jacob was angry and took Laban to task. What is my crime? He asked Laban. How have I wronged you that you hunt me down? Now that you have searched through all my goods, what have you found that belongs to your household? Put it in here in front of your relatives and mine, and let them judge between us. He's saying that knowing nothing's been found, of course. Now, earlier in the passage, Laban had lit into Jacob for leaving them, and they also then accused him of stealing the idols, which, as far as Jacob was concerned, of course, he hadn't done. So now it's Jacob's turn to have his say and to say something back. Jacob is now finally going to get to tell a few home truths to Laban and tell him about all the things he's done to him over the years. And some of these things we are only now being fully made aware of in this passage. They haven't been covered in the narrative so far. I count 6 complaints contained within his statement. It's quite a long little passage, so bear with me. We'll pick it up in verse 38, and where we hear him say this. I have been with you for 20 years now. Your sheep and your goats have not miscarried, nor have I eaten the rams from your flock. I did not bring your animals torn by wild beasts, but I bore the loss myself, and you demanded from me for whatever was stolen by day or night. This was my situation. The heat consumed me in the daytime, and the cold at night, and the sleep fled from my eyes. It was like this for 20 years I was in your household. I worked for 14 years for your 2 daughters, and 6 years for your flocks, and you changed my wages 10 times. If the God of my father, the God of Abraham, and the God of Isaac had not been with me, you would surely have been sent me away empty-handed. But God has seen my hardship and the toil of my hands, and last night he rebuked you. So, what's Jacob been saying? Well, point one, he says in essence, look, he was the shepherd of the flock, and he was careful in taking care of the lambs and the goats, and that there were no miscarriages under his care. He did his job well. The second observation he makes, I never used any of your flock for my own family's food. His third observation, I've been a good employee for you, even when animals were torn by wild beasts. He says, I in fact carried the loss on those occasions. Now, in order to appreciate what he said here, you need to understand that the law of the Near East at that time said that a shepherd was not responsible for the losses of his master's flock due to the attack of a wild animal. So what he's saying here is, I was not legally responsible for the sheep that got eaten or destroyed by wild animals, but I still stood the loss, not you. His fourth observation, which was found in verse 40, says, look, I served you faithfully in all conditions and in all weathers. In 110-degree heat, I served you during the day, and even when it was below freezing at night, I served you through all and every occasion. Number 5, he reminds him that he stayed loyal to his house for 20 years, even though during that time he has changed his wages 10 times. Wait a minute, you might be thinking, he served 7 for Rachel and 7 for Leah. So 20? Well, 20 comes from the deal they made in chapter 30, the previous chapter. He wanted to leave Laban, and Laban had said at that point, no. After he completed his 14 years for Rachel and Leah, he wanted to leave, but Laban said, no, I want you to stay. And that's when they made a new deal about spotted and speckled animals. You'll remember that. So apparently at this point, he has worked for him now. He's done the 6 years of that, which now means he's been with Laban for 20 years. And what he's saying in this passage is that for 20 years, he's faithfully served him. And he's always been faithful to him, even though Laban kept changing the terms of the original deal that they made. We are finding out about things that have gone on here that have not been mentioned before. And at one point he's telling us that during this 6 years, he's changed it. He said, initially he said you can have the speckles, but when they were seen to start multiplying, he changed it and said, no, you just have the spotted. So at this point, we're really finding out the full extent of just how dodgy a character Laban was. Then Jacob makes the final observation in verse 42, and it says that if it hadn't been for God watching over me, that he would have been ruined many, many times over. He's been through it all, he says. As a matter of fact, had it been left to him, to Laban, he would have been cheated out of everything. In other words, he's telling it like it is, but he's also referencing and giving thanks for God for carrying him through, for God for being with him, just like his father Isaac had done before him. And he finishes his statement by saying, God has seen my affliction and the work of my hand. So he's saying God's seen it all. And he's saying, except for the blessing of God, who he names as the God of Abraham and the God of Isaac, he would have gone through this situation for 20 years and have been left empty-handed. But God saw to it that he would be with me, which is exactly what God had told him would be the case when he fled to this land 20 years earlier. Remember, Jacob and his family had been away for 20 years now, and he still hadn't got back home to the place and the land that God had promised that he should be, because that's where God was going to bless him. So what did the Lord say he wanted Jacob to do? At the beginning of this chapter, he reminded him that he wanted him to go home. Remember? Well, he's fled, he's on his way home, he's got halfway home, he's now in the middle of that return journey, and then there's this great conflict goes on. So he's still at this point not back home yet. Okay, you got that? But at least now we have some sort of opportunity to create a lasting peace between him and Laban, maybe clear the air, so to speak. So let's see, they appear to have done that to some extent. Let's see if they finally can make some sort of accommodation of each other and find peace together. But we'll do that in the next episode. So hi friends, welcome back to the Bible Project podcast, and we're in part 3 in the short series where we've been working through the entire chapter of Genesis 31, and we're looking at this situation where Jacob is fleeing from Laban, and we're just asking ourselves about how God sometimes uses difficult circumstances to get us where he wants us to be. So we've reached the point in the story where Jacob and Laban have come together again. In a sense, they've all had their say. They've all said their piece. So let's see if they can make something of this situation and pick up the story in verse 43. And what we're going to cover from there right to the end of the chapter today. But what we need to know, or what I just need to remind you about is before reading these verses for you, is that they have made a covenant in the past. They have made a solemn agreement with each other. In fact, in most translations, the title given to these Bible verses here in chapter 31 are often called Laban's covenant with Jacob. Anyway, with that in mind, let's pick up the text in verse 43. And it says this, "And Laban answered and said to Jacob, These daughters are my daughters, and these children are my children, and this flock is my flock. All that you see is mine. But what can I do this day to these my daughters, or to their children whom they have borne? Now therefore come, let us make a covenant, you and I, and let us be a witness between you and me." So it looks like they're going to make another agreement, doesn't it? So Jacob took a stone and set up a pillar. Then Jacob said to his brethren, "Gather stones." And they took the stones, and they made a heap, and they ate there on that heap. And Laban called it Jagar Sadahuthra, but Jacob called it Galeed. And Laban said, "This heap is a witness between you and me this day." Therefore its name was Galeed. Also Mizpah, because he had said, "May the Lord watch between you and me when we are absent one from another." So there we are. It's quite a lengthy passage. So without going into a great deal of detail, I'll just summarize and say what goes on here simply is that they make a new covenant, and they do it by piling up some stones. And on one pile, they have a sacrifice. So it's like saying they're having a contract. In modern terms, this is like a contract, and they're using the piles of stone, one of the piles to have the sacrifice, and the other to have a sort of celebratory feast to mark the occasions. And they give names to the places that kind of refer to and confirm the covenant that was struck that day. So by calling them those names, it reminds of the covenant from then on in. Now, I think it's important that the terms of this covenant were described to us in the closing verses from verse 50 onwards. I'll just remind you, because it says this: "If you afflict my daughters, or if you take other wives beside my daughters, although no man is with us, see, God is witness between you and me." Then Laban said to Jacob, "Here is this heap, and here is this pillar, which I have placed between you and me. This heap is a witness, and this pillar is a witness, that I will not pass beyond this heap to you, and you will not pass beyond this heap and pillar to me. The God of Abraham, the God of Nahor, and the God of their fathers will judge between us." And Jacob swore by the fear of his father Isaac. So like I said, they've set up a marker on the land, and they both say they will not pass this. They won't pass in either direction. And that is the agreement that they're making this day. And the next verse then says that Jacob offered a sacrifice in the mountain and called his brethren to eat bread. So they eat bread, and they stay all night on the mountain. And early in the morning, Laban rises up, kisses his daughters and blesses them, and then Laban departs and returns to his place. So they offer the sacrifice, and they eat bread, and they have this celebratory, this remembrance meal. And that's how the story closes in verse 55, with them saying goodbye and each going on their separate ways. So what's the point of this story? What's going on in this story? I really had to meditate on this for a while while looking at the story, not so I could just try and draw out, extrapolate out, not just what the basic story tells, but what it means for us today. And I decided, friends, that there are several things going on here, and that I get two main things out of this story. I think what jumps off the page, straight away, is that when you look at the big picture and take a helicopter view, is that we can see that the Lord remains faithful to his promise. Back in chapter 8, in chapter 28, a while ago, he said to Jacob and reminded him that he will be with you. And the Lord, he reminded him that he had made a covenant, not just with his grandfather Abraham and his father Isaac, but that covenant applied to him also. One that said that he was going to live in the land that he had originally come from. So he's revealing to Jacob at this point that if he's going to give him the land, then in a sense he needs to be back there in that land, doesn't he? So I think the reason that this story is recorded in the book of Genesis is to reveal and to clarify and to confirm that the overall scheme of things, as revealed in the book of Genesis, is that the Lord will always remain faithful to his promises. He is faithful to the promise he made to Jacob, and that promise was to protect him and to bless him. And he did this at this time, not only by appearing to Jacob to remind him and tell him to return to the land of Bethel in order that that promise could be fulfilled in him and he could receive the full blessing of it, but he also did it by appearing in a dream to Laban on his way to confront Jacob and telling Laban to make peace with his son-in-law. It's as if the Lord is throwing a protective bubble over and around Jacob. And one of the ways he does it here is he says to Laban, who's potentially hostile towards him, don't touch him. So the Lord protected Jacob. Many years ago I read a story set in Victorian times about an Englishman who was travelling abroad and had the misfortune of being seized by local warlords who held him hostage under the threat of death. A diplomat from what I think was then called the British Council asked to see the prisoner, and as a prelude to any discussions or negotiations about this man's future, he threw a British flag over the man, and he said, if you fire on that flag or cause any harm to that man, then you are firing your fire against the whole British nation. Now, I'm not sure that would work, but it seemed to work back in the days when this story was set in Victorian times. Well, beloved, what's happening here, it's almost like God is throwing his protective banner over Jacob. And one of the ways he does it, and is revealed here, is he warns Laban not to touch him. One of the great lessons that comes out of this Bible story, I believe, is that God wants to and will do and will continue to protect his children. I don't know if you remember, right back at the beginning of this study of chapter 31, I previewed what I said by making the statement that I felt there was a bit of a surprise at the end. I think I called it a sting in the tail. And the surprise for me is drawn not in the straight narrative, but out of the conclusion that we can draw out of it. Remember, at the beginning of the story, Jacob wanted to go home. The call of God in his life was at that point was a call that he should return to his homeland. But Jacob wasn't originally in that sort of mental space, was he? So what did God use to motivate and convince Jacob to go home? Do you remember what he used in those opening verses? It's one of the first things I said and we looked at when we opened this chapter up. What was his motivation to get Jacob to get out of town at the beginning of this chapter? Well, I don't blame you if you've forgotten, because it's kind of a lengthy chapter, this. It's 55 verses long. Let me read again the three opening verses for you. Genesis chapter 31, verses 1 to 3, where it tells us this. Now Jacob heard the word of Laban's sons, saying, Jacob has taken away all that was our father's, and from what was our father's he has acquired all our wealth. And Jacob saw the countenance, in other words, the facial attitude of Laban, and he saw that it was indeed not favourable towards him as before. Then the Lord said to Jacob, return to the land of your fathers, to your family, and I will be with you. So at that point he reminds him of the promise. So the first thing we see happening here is the fact that Laban's sons get jealous. Jacob's brother-in-laws are getting jealous of his wealth and prosperity, and that Laban is becoming ill-disposed to Jacob. It is the negative actions of the unbelievers around him that are instrumental in convincing Jacob to get out of town. He then says to his wives, Rachel and Leah, he says, have you heard what your brothers are saying about me? Have you seen the expression on your father's face? I really think it's time we should leave. Do you remember that? So these here are the points I want to make in the story. This is the sting in the tail. Number one, yes, indeed, God does protect his children. Number two, God does keep his promises. But the sting in the tail is sometimes he uses strange or even what we perceive as negative motivators as a way for us to get out and do what he wants us to do. Many years ago, when I was in a secular job in the world, I was promoted way too early and was running a team where I was expected to motivate people to do well and to hit targets. And I didn't have a lot of experience then, and I probably wasn't very good at the job. And I remember one of my managers said to me, the problem with you, McCandless, is that you believe all motivators must be positive. Isn't that interesting? Have you ever, when we look at this passage and think about the fact, I wonder if you've ever heard the expression God moves in mysterious ways? Well, what did God use in this case to move Jacob? God used in this case the jealousy of his brother-in-laws in order to initiate the motivation for Jacob to do what he ought to be doing already. In other words, to get up and move. God used a hostile attitude signalled by an angry and disapproving father to persuade Jacob to get out of where he shouldn't be and get to where God wanted him to be. So the question we have to ask ourselves is, does God really do that sort of thing? Will God sometimes use negative scenarios around us to get us to move on? Will God sometimes use jealousy, anger, hostility in other people to sometimes get his will done in us? Well, it appears to me that he does, beloved. And I think this is important because we need to understand that God can always be speaking to us, even in the most difficult times, even in the times where we're being treated unfairly, even among the craziness of life. So if someone is being hostile to you, maybe the Lord wants to teach you something through it. Who knows, the Lord may well use this situation to accompany his will in your life. If someone is jealous of you, if someone is envious of you, if someone is upset with you, it shouldn't at a profound spiritual level really bother us if we know that we're being fair with them, because we know that God may still use this uncomfortable situation as a process for doing his will. He will even, in the midst of jealousy and anger and hostility and all sorts of other stupid stuff towards us, be working in our lives to get us to get to where we need to get to. If you know that the Lord is working in your life, it doesn't matter what people around you are doing. You can kind of put their jealousy or anger or hostility into perspective, and in a sense say, you know what, that's their problem, not yours. My purpose is just to try and discern the will of God. We just have to trust the Lord to work in our lives, and maybe even recognize that the persecution of others is sometimes used by God to get us where we need to be in life. But can you think of any other examples in the Bible? I'm going to try and close with an illustration, and an illustration that I think fits this scenario perfectly, but from a New Testament context. And to do that, we're going to just look briefly at Philippians chapter 1. Now, I never forget the first time I read this, and someone actually said it to me. Someone I was a financial advisor, and I was in the house, and the guy was a pastor, and we were talking, and I can't remember anything else he said, but the one thing he stuck in my head all these years, and it's 30 odd years ago, he referenced this scripture. And at the time, I scratched my head, and I remember thinking, you got to be kidding me. God doesn't really work like that, does he? But that's what the text is going to say here. And sure enough, I've returned to it again as an adult, as a more mature believer, and I've discovered, yes, the text not only says that, but that's definitely what it means. So let's look for a moment at Philippians chapter 1. But before I read the text, let me give you a little bit of background to what's going on here, because this is right at the opening of this letter, and we need to understand that this letter of Paul was written while he was in jail. When Paul was in jail in Rome, he wrote 4 letters. He wrote Ephesians, Colossians, this one Philippians, and a short letter called Philemon, all written in jail. And this is one of the 4 what are referred to as the prison letters, by the way. So he's in jail, which is not a good place to be, obviously, and he's got to explain to his followers what's going on, and he wants to explain how he's handling this potentially negative situation. And this is what he says, reading from verse 12. Now I want you to know, brothers and sisters, that what has happened to me has actually served to advance the gospel. So he's saying, I'm in jail, but you know what? The way this has turned out, it's given me an opportunity to preach the gospel. As a result, continuing verse 13, as a result, it has become clear throughout the whole palace guard and to everyone else that I am in chains for Christ. Now, the point is, he's been guarded by the palace guards, called the Praetorian Guard, in fact. And that meant that he had 4 guards, 4 soldiers at a time guarding him, and he would have been handcuffed to 2 of them at any one time. So there are these 4 soldiers with him, watching him every time, and every 4 hours that shift and those soldiers get changed. So he gets a new set of 4 soldiers every 4 hours. That means 24 guards a day, every day, 24/7. Which is why he says in verse 14, and because of my chains, most of the brothers and sisters have been confident in the Lord and dare all the more to proclaim the gospel without fear. So he says, I'm in jail, and the gospel's being spread throughout the whole Praetorian Guard and the people in the jail. It's being spread among these elite soldiers of Rome. The gospel is being spread through the palace guards, and the news, he said, is reaching other Christians, both in the prison and outside and around the city. See what I'm doing, see what is happening, even whilst I'm in jail, he says. And then he says, if I can do this in jail, then we can do it out of jail. So be encouraged. Then he says, picking up in verse 15, it is true that some preach Christ out of envy and rivalry, but others out of goodwill. The latter do so out of love, knowing that I am put here in defense of the gospel. The former preach Christ out of selfish ambition, not sincerely, supposing they can stir up trouble for while I'm in chains. But what does it matter? The important thing is that in every way, whether from false motives or true, Christ is preached, and because of this I rejoice. Doesn't that blow your mind, friends? He says, let me tell you something else. Some of people out there are preaching the gospel out of jealousy and selfish ambition. Some are preaching it because they think, you know what? Paul's in jail. I can preach the gospel, create division, and take his place as a leader of this Christian community. And Paul says, you know what? As long as I preach Christ and they preach Christ, then the truth will cut through. And I don't care whether it is done even out of false motives, truth, or jealousy. I don't care, because he says, I know that God gets his work done as long as his word, the true gospel, is being preached. So sometimes that tells me this is really helpful, because sometimes we'll see things in the world and we'll wonder, maybe even within the church, what are the motives of the Christians in behind what they're doing? And I can still be encouraged of that as long as I can see that the true gospel is being preached. And also sometimes when I face, or when we face criticism, or maybe even out and out persecution, knowing this truth means we can be encouraged, because we can still see that God will use these things to have his will done, and he may even use them to get us to where we need to be. Sometimes God will use strange ways and deeds to get us to do his will. So don't let jealousy, don't let envy, or don't let anything else, or someone else even doing things in a different way, bother you. Just figure out what it is the Lord wants you to do and do it. And as Paul says in his letter to Philippians, just do it and rejoice.